You must always expect the unexpected when you step into our world. From shocking plot twists to heart-pounding endings, we bring you drama redefined for the modern age of digital cinema. Click subscribe now and get ready for your next big thrill.
Returned home for Christmas Eve. The driveway was empty. So was the house, except for my husband's grandmother sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea and a crossword puzzle she'd stopped halfway through. A note on the counter said, "Gone skiing with the team. Grandma Opal needs her medications by 6. There's soup in the fridge. Be back Sunday. Derek." The old woman looked up at me over her reading glasses. Her eyes were sharp in a way that surprised me. "He didn't tell you, did he?" she said. I didn't answer. She already knew. 4 days later, my husband was calling from a ski lodge, begging me to delete everything I'd found. The note was handwritten on a post-it, which somehow made it worse, like I was a reminder on a grocery list. Pick up milk, feed the dog, wife will handle grandma. I'd driven 4 hours from Atlanta. I'd left my sister's Christmas party early, told my nephews I'd see them next week. Declined the mulled wine my brother-in-law had been warming on the stove since noon. I had a car full of wrapped presents, a cashmere sweater for Derek, a first edition cookbook for his mother, a tin of shortbread for Grandma Opal, because Derek had mentioned once, offhandedly, that she used to bake it every December before her hands got bad. The house in Asheville belonged to Derek's family. His mother was supposed to be hosting this year. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. That had always been the kitchen holding that post-it for what felt like a long time. "Soup's not actually any good," said Grandma Opal. "He brought it from a gas station, the kind in the plastic cup." She was 81 years old, small and precise, with silver hair pinned at the back of her neck. She'd been staying in the downstairs guest room since October, ostensibly so Derek's mother could keep an eye on her while her hip healed. The room, I noticed now, had a folding tray table with a plastic cup of soup, a glass of water, and nothing else. No Christmas decorations. No radio. No cards on the windowsill. I set my purse down. When did they leave? Wednesday morning. She turned a page of her crossword book without looking up. "Your husband carried the ski bags out to the truck at 6 a.m. His mother wore a new coat." I watched from the window. Wednesday. That was 2 days ago. I'd spoken to Derek on the phone Wednesday night. He'd said he was tired, that his mother was already asleep, that the mountain air was good. I tried his cell. Straight to voicemail. I tried his mother's. Same. I went to the refrigerator out of some automatic impulse and opened it. 2 gas station soup cups, a stick of butter, and a bottle of white wine with about a third left in it. That was everything. "I brought groceries," I said, more to myself than to her. "Good," she said. More to myself than to her. "Good," she said. I haven't had a real meal since Tuesday. I drove to the Ingalls on Merrimon because it was the only thing open on Christmas Eve past 4. I moved through the store in a kind of controlled daze, picking up things I knew how to cook rather than things I'd planned. A small pork loin, sweet potatoes, green beans, a bag of clementines. At the bakery counter, a woman was loading the last of the dinner rolls into a bag and I added those too. In the car, I checked Instagram. I don't know why. Some reflex. Derek had been tagged in a photo. His colleague Simone, the one he'd started mentioning more often this fall, the one whose name came up in ways I'd been training myself not to notice, had posted a carousel. Mountain view at golden hour. Matching beanies. His arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something out of frame. His mother was in one of the photos too, holding a glass of wine at what looked like a lodge dinner. She looked rested. She looked like someone on vacation. Not someone who'd needed a break from caregiving. I sat in that parking lot for 7 minutes. I know because the car's clock moved from 4052 to 4059 while I stared at nothing. Then I drove back to the house and made Christmas Eve dinner for an 81-year-old woman I barely knew. Grandma Opal ate slowly and thoroughly. She complimented the pork without fuss and asked me to pass the green beans twice. When I brought out the clementines at the end, she peeled one with the careful deliberateness of someone who takes pleasure in small, precise things. "You knew about Simone," I said. It came out quieter than I intended. She didn't pretend not to understand. "I know she's called the house 4 times since October." Pretty voice. Very confident for someone calling a married man's family home. I looked at my hands. "How long have you known?" "I'm old, not blind." She set down her clementine peel in a neat pile. I also know what my grandson is. I've known his whole life, which is longer than you've known him, and it doesn't make it hurt less to say it. She paused. How long have you two been married? 6 years in March. She nodded slowly. His grandfather and I were married for 54 years. I have some idea of what 6 years of good faith looks like. And I have some idea of what this is good faith looks like. And I have some idea of what this is. I didn't cry. I'd been saving that for later, for somewhere private. Instead, I refilled her water glass and started clearing the dishes. There's something I want to show you, she said, after you finished. The guest room was small, but she'd made it her own in ways that made me feel ashamed I hadn't noticed sooner. Photographs on the nightstand. A library book with a cloth bookmark. A small wooden jewelry box on the dresser, the kind with a clasp that sticks. She moved around it with the careful efficiency of someone who has learned to manage in a space that isn't quite hers. From beneath the folding tray table, she lifted a manila envelope and held it out. My doctor sent these in November, she said. Derek's mother signed for the package. I never saw it until I found it in the recycling bin 3 weeks later. Inside were letters from her cardiologist and a referral to a specialist in Charlotte. A follow-up appointment that had passed, unattended, in early December. A prescription adjustment that had never been filled. I looked at the dates, looked at her. They knew? I said. They knew I needed to see someone. Whether they read it carefully enough to understand how much, I can't say. She folded her hands in her lap. I don't want to believe the worst of people. But I'm also a practical woman, and I'd been doing arithmetic. The arithmetic was this. Grandma Opal had a modest estate. A house in Hendersonville she'd lived in for 40 years. A savings account. Some bonds her late husband had kept. Derek was her only grandchild. His mother, Derek's mother, was not a blood relation, technically. She was Derek's father's second wife. But Grandma Opal had known her for 20 years and trusted her the way you trust someone who has always been polite and helpful and available in ways that, looking back, may have always had a direction to them. I updated my will in September, Grandma Opal said, before the hip surgery. I named Derek as primary beneficiary. She looked at me. I've been reconsidering. Her name was actually Eleanor. Opal was what her late husband had called her, something from an old joke between them about her grandmother's ring, and it had stuck so completely that most people didn't know her given name anymore. She told me this later that night when we'd moved to the living room, when I'd found the good blanket in the hall closet and brought it to her without being asked. Small things like that, she noticed them. She thanked me in a way that wasn't performative, just direct. She told me about her husband, a civil engineer named Walter who'd built bridges in 3 states, about the house in Hendersonville, which had a garden that produced more tomatoes than 2 people could ever eat, and which she'd had to stop tending after her knees went, about Derek's father, Walter's son from a first marriage, who'd been charming in the way of people who have learned early that charm is a more efficient tool than effort. Derek is very much his father's son, she said. Not meanly. Just as fact. I hoped he wouldn't be. I hoped you might change that. I thought I was, I said. For a while, I thought I was. She looked at the dark window. Walter used to say that you can't fix a person's character with love. You can only decide how much of your own time and dignity you're willing to spend trying. I thought about the 6 years. The studio apartment I'd given up to move into his place. The clients I'd let go because Derek said the late nights weren't worth what they paid. The savings account I'd contributed to faithfully, the one he'd emptied in November. I'd checked that morning, already knowing what I'd find. $11,400 gone in a single transfer labeled travel/miss. He emptied our joint account, I said. Eleanor nodded. She wasn't surprised. There's something else, she said. Help me with the top dresser drawer. Behind a stack of her late husband's letters, which she kept bundled with a rubber band and would not explain further, was a smaller envelope. Inside were 2 things. A handwritten letter from her attorney, a woman named Rosalind Fitch in Hendersonville, who had apparently been her family's lawyer for 30 years, and a folded document that turned out to be a property deed. The house in Hendersonville was not in Eleanor's name. It was held in a trust Walter had established in 1987. The kind that passes outside of probate, outside of a standard will. The trust named a successor trustee who was not Derek, not his mother, but a man named Arthur Wen, her husband's former business partner, who was still alive and still in Charlotte and who Eleanor had spoken to by phone just 2 weeks ago. Derek's mother told him the house would come to him, Eleanor said. Derek has been counting on it. He mentioned it to me directly in October, told me the market was good, that he'd already spoken to a real estate agent. She paused. I didn't correct him. I stared at the document. Does he know about the trust? He knows I own a house. He assumes that means he'll inherit it. A very slight smile. He never asked to see the actual paperwork. There was also the matter of the savings bonds, 37 of them, purchased over 30 years of patient accumulation, stored not in a safe deposit box at any local bank, but with Arthur Wen's firm, catalogued and current, worth considerably more than Eleanor had ever mentioned to anyone in Derek's family. How much? I asked, and then immediately said, I'm sorry, that's not more than enough, she said simply. Walter was methodical. I learned from him. She reached over and put her hand on mine. Her hands were dry and warm. I don't have children of my own, she said. I had Walter, and then I had time, and then my hip gave out and I ended up in this room. She looked around it without self-pity. I was going to leave everything to Derek because he was what was left. And then you came in tonight and made me dinner and asked how I was feeling and drove to 3 different places trying to find a pharmacy open on Christmas Eve to get my blood pressure medication filled. I had driven to 3 places. The third one, a 24-hour CVS 12 miles away, had finally had it in stock. I hadn't thought of it as anything remarkable. I want to change my will, Eleanor said, and I'd like your help to do it. I called Rosalind Fitch the next morning, Christmas Day, not expecting anyone to answer. She answered on the second ring. She was 70-ish, matter-of-fact in a way that reminded me of Eleanor, and completely unsurprised to hear that Eleanor was in Asheville without adequate medical care and wanted to revisit her estate documents. I've been waiting for Eleanor to call me back for 6 weeks, she said. Whatever you need, I'll be there by Thursday. In the meantime, I focused on what was in front of me. Eleanor's missed cardiology appointment needed to be rescheduled. Her prescription for a blood thinner had also lapsed. I found the empty bottle behind the soup cups, and the pharmacy needed a new authorization from her doctor. I made calls. I kept a log. My background is in healthcare administration, which I'd done before I married Derek and slowly, incrementally, let atrophy. It came back quickly. Eleanor's neighbor, a retired school teacher named Bet, who lived 2 houses down and who had apparently been dropping off casseroles and worrying quietly for months, arrived Thursday morning with a dish of baked pasta and a look of visible relief that someone was finally there. She'd seen Derek's mother leave Wednesday. She'd known Eleanor was alone. I knocked, Bet said. Eleanor told me she was fine. She wouldn't want to be a bother. I know, I said. She's not a bother, Bet said fiercely. I know, I said again. Over the next 2 days, 4 more neighbors came by. One had a spare key Eleanor had given him for emergencies. One brought firewood. Each of them had a story. The time Eleanor had fallen on the porch steps and Derek's mother had driven past without stopping. The Christmas 2 years ago when Eleanor had spent the holiday entirely alone. The way she'd stopped going to church because no one offered to drive her, and she couldn't manage the walk from the parking lot on bad days. I wrote everything down. Rosalind arrived Thursday as promised, along with a notary she'd worked with for decades. Eleanor was having a better day. The blood pressure medication was working, she'd slept well, and she'd asked me that morning to help her find a particular cardigan she liked, the green one with the wooden buttons. We worked at the kitchen table for most of the afternoon. Eleanor was precise and certain. She answered every question Rosalind asked without hesitation. At one point the notary, a quiet man who gave the impression of having witnessed everything and being moved by nothing, set down his pen and looked at the document in front of him, with an expression that might have been something like respect. Miss Eleanor, he said, you are the most organized person I have worked with in 32 years of this work. Eleanor smiled at him. Walter taught me that a woman who controls her own paperwork controls her own life. The new will was straightforward. The trust was already structured. It didn't need to change, only the successor provisions within it. What needed amending was the will itself, which redirected Eleanor's remaining accounts and personal property to a combination of elder care organizations in western North Carolina and, specifically named, to me. I tried to object. Don't, Eleanor said simply. I'm not doing this as a transaction. I'm doing it because Walter always said the people who deserve things are usually the ones who never ask for them. And I'd watched you for 4 days and I know what I see. Derek called Saturday morning. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I answered the third time. "How's Grandma?" he said. The connection was a little crackling. Mountains, probably. "She's doing better," I said. "Her cardiologist is concerned about some things that weren't being monitored." A pause. "She always exaggerates." "She missed a referral appointment in December," I said. "The letter came here. It ended up in the recycling bin. That must have been a mix-up. Her blood thinner prescription had also lapsed. There was nothing in the refrigerator but gas station soup." I kept my voice level. "She hadn't had a real meal since Tuesday." Another pause, longer this time. "Look, we can talk about this when I get back. Rosalind Fitch came by on Thursday," I said. "Eleanor wanted to update some documents." The silence that followed was different from the others. "What documents?" he said. "You should ask a lawyer," I said. "I think you'll have questions." He called back 6 more times before noon. I documented each one, time-stamped, duration, a note on what was said. They came home Sunday. Derek first through the door, still in his ski jacket, sunburned at the nose, stopping short when he saw me standing in the living room with my hands at my sides. His mother behind him with a designer duffel, and then, trailing slightly, Simona, who had apparently come to help with the bags, or perhaps just hadn't thought about how this particular arrival would look. Eleanor was in her chair by the window. "You're looking well, Grandma," Derek said, recovering quickly. "I am," she said, recovering quickly. "I am," she said. "Thanks to your wife." He turned to me. Something in his face shifted through several calculations. "We should talk privately. We can talk here," I said. He tried charm first, then concern, then a version of events in which the note had been a miscommunication, the cruise had been last minute. His mother genuinely had needed the break, and he'd been planning to call more, but the signal on the mountain was unreliable. His mother said nothing. She was watching Eleanor. Eleanor was watching her tea. "There are some things you should know," I said. I opened the folder I'd put together over the past 4 days. The missed medical appointments, the lapsed prescriptions, the bank statements showing the transfers from Eleanor's personal account for care expenses that had never materialized in any tangible form, the neighbor statements, the log I'd kept. Derek's face went through several more calculations. "I'd like you to hear something," I said, and I handed him the letter. It was Eleanor's letter, dictated to Rosalind on Thursday afternoon, to be read to the family. Eleanor had not written it in anger. She had written it with the careful precision of someone who has decided that clarity is more valuable than comfort. "I am 81 years old," she had written. "I have been treated in these last years as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I do not say this to cause pain. I say it because I have learned at this late hour that silence on behalf of others' comfort is a form of harm to oneself. Walter taught me this, though it took me too long to listen." She described specific things. The Christmas she'd spent alone, the appointment that wasn't kept, the way her name was said in this house, with patience, the kind of patience that carries a weight underneath it. "The greatest loss is not losing the people you love. It is discovering that the people you loved saw you primarily as something to be inherited." Derek put the letter down before he finished it. "She can't do this," he said. She was medicated, she was confused. She was examined by 2 physicians this week," I said. "Both certified her competence. The notary can speak to that. So can Rosalind Fitch, who has known Eleanor for 30 years. His mother said quietly. "The house." "The house," I said, "was never yours to inherit." I laid the trust document on the table. I watched Derek read it, watched him read it again. "She's leaving everything to you," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "She's leaving what she chooses to leave to whoever she chooses." I picked up my coat from the chair where I'd laid it an hour ago, already knowing how this would go. "What I'm leaving is different." I set my key on the console table. Not the house key. This wasn't my house to leave a key to. My house key. Our apartment. The one I'd moved into 6 years ago and slowly made less mine, year by year, the way water finds the path of least resistance. "Simone is standing in the doorway," I said. "You should probably introduce her properly." Derek followed me out to the porch. The begging was real enough. I'll give him that. There was something genuine in it. The way a person is most genuine when they understand for the first time what they've actually lost. "You can fight the will," I said. "Rosalind says you'll spend more than you gain and you won't win. But that's your choice to make." "Jade, I love." "Don't use my name right now," I said. You left your grandmother alone without medication at Christmas, and then you lied to me about it. Those are two different things, and both of them are what they are." He had nothing to say to that. I walked to my car. The morning was cold, clear. The kind of December morning that looks like the inside of a snow globe. Bet was walking her dog on the opposite sidewalk. She raised a hand, I raised mine. Eleanor had said goodbye to me that morning before they arrived. She'd held my hands in both of hers and looked at me the way Walter must have looked at things he wanted to remember. "Come see me in Hendersonville," she said. "The tomatoes are terrible in winter, but the house is warm, and I want someone to tell me what's worth keeping in that garden." I told her I would. I meant it. Rosalind called me 2 months later to tell me that Derek had consulted 3 attorneys and been advised by all 3 not to contest. His mother had stopped responding to Eleanor's calls, which Eleanor noted without visible distress. Simone had, apparently, lost interest once the ski season ended. I was back in Atlanta. I'd started taking clients again, a few at first, then more. The old contacts who were glad to hear from me. I had a small apartment near my sister's neighborhood, a coffee maker I actually liked, and a Saturday morning routine that was entirely my own. Eleanor sent me a card in February. Inside she tucked a photograph, herself and Walter at what must have been their 30th or 40th anniversary, standing in front of the Hendersonville house in summer, the garden behind them unreasonably full of tomatoes. On the back, in her handwriting, "Come in June. I'll show you which ones are worth saving." I pinned it above my desk. The night Victor passed, I mean the night Eleanor called to tell me her health had stabilized, that the new cardiologist was pleased, that she'd had neighbors in for dinner and made shortbread for the first time in 3 years, because her hands, she said, were better than they'd been in a long time. I sat with the phone after we hung up and didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I'd done something that needed doing, like I'd shown up for someone who'd been waiting a long time for someone to show up. Walter would have called that a fair trade. I think he was right. Thank you for staying through this story to the end. The moment I keep coming back to is Eleanor peeling a clementine at the kitchen table on Christmas Eve, slow and precise, like someone who refuses to let the circumstances of a thing diminish the pleasure of it. Which part stayed with you? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that Christmas, not in any mystical sense, just the plain, ordinary mechanics of it. The choices people make accumulate. They stack up quietly over months and years, and then one day the stack tips, and everyone acts surprised by the direction it falls. Derek wasn't surprised by a sudden stroke of bad luck. He was surprised that the choices he'd been making for 6 years finally caught up to him all at once, in the same week, in the same house, in front of the same woman he'd underestimated for the entirety of their marriage. That's the thing about people who treat others as background characters in their own story. They stop paying attention. They assume the furniture stays where they put it. Eleanor had been keeping records for 2 years. Not out of malice, out of clarity. She'd watched her grandson the way you watch weather you've seen before, and she'd decided, quietly and without drama, that she wasn't going to leave what she'd spent a lifetime building to someone who saw her primarily as a line item on a future balance sheet. She didn't need anyone to tell her that was the right thing to do. She already knew. She'd just been waiting for the circumstances to make it possible. What I keep coming back to is this. I didn't go to Asheville with any intention of changing my life. I went because I thought I was going to a family Christmas. I ended up making dinner for a woman I barely knew, driving to 3 pharmacies in the cold, sitting in a quiet room listening to someone describe a marriage that had lasted 54 years and what it actually cost to build something real. None of that was part of any plan, but I think that's how the most important things happen, not because you strategized your way into them, but because you showed up when it would have been easier not to, and kept showing up, and paid attention to what was actually in front of you, instead of what you wished was there. Eleanor taught me something about intelligence that I hadn't thought about before. That the sharpest thing a person can do is see clearly, especially when clarity is uncomfortable. She'd seen Derek clearly for years. She'd seen her own situation clearly, and instead of letting that knowledge make her bitter, she'd used it to make careful, deliberate decisions that no one could undo after she was gone. That's not coldness. That's a particular kind of wisdom that only comes from having lived long enough to know that hope without honesty is just postponed disappointment. As for me, I learned that dignity isn't something other people give you. It's something you decide to keep. Derek took a lot of things from me over 6 years: a studio, clients, confidence, money. What he couldn't take was the part of me that knew how to show up for someone who needed it. Even on Christmas Eve. Even when I was the one who'd just been blindsided. That part turned out to be the part that mattered. I'm not the same person who drove to Asheville that December. I don't think I'd want to be. The person who drove there was still waiting for Derek to become who she'd thought he was. The person who drove back had stopped waiting and started building. Eleanor's tomatoes came in strong the following June. She was right, some of them were absolutely worth saving.